A lost submarine that surfaced after 50 years, with its entire crew alive. The call came in at 3:47 on a Tuesday morning, and Lieutenant Commander Reyes almost didn't answer it. She was 3 weeks from retirement. 31 years in the German Federal Maritime Authority, the last 9 of them managing the Bremerhaven Coastal Monitoring Station, and she had developed a careful relationship with late-night calls, the kind where you learn to let certain things ring out. But the duty officer on the other end was a 23-year-old named Hoffman who had never once called her after midnight, and something in the pitch of his voice made her pick up before the second ring had finished.
"There's a contact," he said.
40 kilometers out. Subsurface. Moving at approximately 4 knots toward the outer harbor channel. Fishing trawler running dark? No, ma'am. A pause. She could hear him breathing. The displacement signature is wrong. It's too heavy for any surface vessel at that draft. And the shape, he stopped. Hoffman. It looks like a submarine. She was in the monitoring room within 20 minutes, still pulling her jacket straight, and by then 3 other people had gathered around the primary radar console in the particular way that people gather when they don't want to be the one standing closest to something they can't explain. The contact was there. Clean return, moving with deliberate steadiness, bearing 247 degrees. Depth now rising as the bottom shelved toward the channel approach. Reyes studied the readout for a long time without speaking. German submarines hadn't operated in these waters since 1945. The Federal Republic maintained a small submarine fleet, but every vessel was accounted for. Their transponders active, their positions logged, their captains reachable by radio within minutes. She checked the fleet status board before she even reached for the radio. All vessels present. All vessels stationary. Whatever was out there had no transponder signal at all. She tried hailing it on standard naval frequencies. Silence. She tried the international distress channels. Silence. She tried, on an instinct she couldn't quite articulate, a handful of older bands, the kind that hadn't carried operational traffic since the early Cold War years. The response came back immediately. Not voice. Morse code. Tapped out in a cadence so steady it sounded almost mechanical, and yet there was something in the rhythm, a slight hesitation between each group, the ghost of a human hand, that told her someone was actually sitting down there in the dark, keying this out by hand. The duty cryptographer translated it in under 4 minutes, though he looked increasingly uncomfortable as he worked. It was an identification sequence. U-boat number, vessel class, flotilla designation, commanding officer's name. The formatting was an exact match for standard Kriegsmarine communication protocols, the kind that hadn't been used since 1944. Reyes read it twice. Then she picked up a different phone, the one that connected to the Naval Intelligence Liaison, and began the conversation she would later describe, in her official report, as the most difficult of her career. By 6 o'clock, the outer harbor was sealed. 2 Federal Navy patrol vessels sat at the channel mouth. A Coast Guard helicopter circled in wide arcs overhead, its thermal camera producing readings that the pilot radioed in with visible uncertainty in his voice. The contact was ascending now, quite deliberately, as if whoever was below had done this 1,000 times and saw no reason to rush. The intelligence liaison, a man named Schreiber who had flown in from Hamburg on a military transport and arrived with his tie already loosened, stood beside Reyes at the harbor wall and watched the water. The records, he said, are not ambiguous. He meant the war records. She had already seen them by then. The duty archivist had pulled them within the hour, digitized files cross-referenced against the identification sequence from the transmission. The submarine that had just identified itself was listed in the German Naval Archive as U-977 class, hull designation modified, commissioned in early 1944. Its last confirmed position report had been filed in March of that year, somewhere in the North Atlantic. It had been declared lost with all hands in September 1944 after failing to report for 60 days. Declared lost. 79 years ago. There must be an error in the identification, Schreiber said, though his voice carried no conviction. Reyes said nothing. She was watching the water at the harbor mouth, where something was beginning to disturb the surface, a long, low boiling, the sea pushing upward from underneath as the hull rose. It broke the surface slowly. That was the thing that lodged itself permanently in her memory afterward. Not the scale of it, not the impossible wrongness of its presence, but the patience of it. The tower came first, streaming white water from every angle, and then the hull rose in sections as the ballast tanks cleared, and within 3 minutes the entire vessel was on the surface, sitting in the harbor's outer roads with the quiet authority of something that had simply decided to stop being hidden. It was a submarine. There was no other word for it. Long, black, low in the water, the whole design unmistakably mid-century, the conning tower configuration matching the profile photographs that Schreiber's people had already pulled from the archive files and were holding up against the sight line with something close to disbelief. The deck fittings, the gun mount position, the hull numbers still clearly visible, still painted in the style of the wartime era. The hull itself was clean. That was wrong. That was the first thing that a marine engineer named Fisher, who had been woken at 4:30 and driven here at speed by people who refused to explain why, said when he got his first good look through the harbor's optical sensors. In 79 years of submersion, any steel hull would have accumulated decades of marine growth. Barnacles, serpulid worm tubes, bryozoans layered over bryozoans, the accumulated biological weight of nearly 8 decades underwater. The hull should have been unrecognizable beneath the growth. Fisher had seen wrecks pulled from far shallower water than the North Atlantic that looked like floating gardens. This hull looked like it had been painted last month. Not possible, Fisher said, 3 times, each time quieter, until the 3rd time it was barely audible. The vessel drifted to a stop. And then, without any instruction from the harbor authority, without any guidance from the patrol vessel sitting 50 meters off its bow, it began, slowly, perfectly, to align itself with the outer docking berth. The movement was too precise to be current or tide. Someone was at the controls. Someone knew exactly where they were going. The lines went out automatically from the dock winches once the hull was within range, and then the submarine was secured, sitting against the dock fenders with the stillness of something that had always been there, and the hatches remained sealed, and nothing moved on the deck. And the harbor fell into a silence that Reyes would later struggle to describe to the inquiry committee as anything other than the specific silence of something that was waiting. They waited 4 hours before opening the hatch. The decision process was, in retrospect, not rational. It was the product of committee paralysis, of too many agencies with overlapping jurisdiction and insufficient precedent, of people who kept reaching for protocols that didn't quite cover this. But in the end, it was simpler than any of them expected. At 10:23, the forward hatch opened from the inside. Reyes was part of the boarding team. She had insisted, and eventually people had stopped arguing with her. She went down through the hatch second, behind a naval officer named Bauer, who had done this before on legitimate vessels, and whose hands were, she noticed, very still. The smell hit her before her eyes adjusted. A close, recycled, metallic smell. The kind of air that has been breathed and rebreathed in a sealed space, filtered and compressed and breathed again, and underneath it something harder to name, something that made her think involuntarily of museum storage rooms, of objects kept in the dark for a very long time. They were assembled in the forward compartment. 23 men, standing or seated in the casual, arranged way of people who have known each other in a confined space for a long time and have settled into their positions naturally. Dressed in the naval working uniforms of the Second World War era. Equipment around them, radios, navigation instruments, mechanical gauges, that matched exactly the period of the vessel's construction. They were looking at Reyes and Bauer with expressions that were not afraid, not aggressive, not confused. The expressions were something closer to relief. Reyes thought, the particular controlled relief of people who have been holding their composure under pressure for a very long time and have just been told the pressure is off. The man who stepped forward was in his mid-30s. Brown hair, lean face, the kind of physical condition that came from regular work in a confined space. He wore the rank insignia of a captain-lieutenant, a lieutenant commander, which was the rank listed in the archive file as the commanding officer of this vessel. He looked at Reyes. He looked at her uniform, the modern cut of it, the insignia, the fabric. He looked at the equipment visible through the hatch behind her. His expression shifted almost imperceptibly. He said, in German, in an accent that linguists would later describe as consistent with Northern German dialect patterns of the early 20th century. "How long have we been gone?" Reyes told him. He received this information without visible reaction, which told her more than any reaction could have. He had already known on some level that it was a long time. He had already done the calculation, in whatever way was available to him. He simply hadn't known the number. He nodded once. Then he said, "We were trying to come back."
The whole time.
We were always trying to come back. The logs covered 47 years. That was the number the archivists arrived at eventually, working through the physical logbooks retrieved from the navigation station. 47 years of entries, written in multiple hands, the handwriting shifting in places as different crew members took over duties, the ink changing color across different sections as they switched to whatever reserve supplies they had, the paper showing the particular texture of pages that have been handled many times in humid conditions. 47 years. Not 50. Not 79. The crew had experienced 47 years of subjective time inside that vessel, which meant that by their internal reckoning they had been gone since 1991, still an impossibility, still a number that made the interview teams pause and check their notes. But a different kind of impossibility than the external reality of 79 years. The logs described a world that had no adequate language for what they encountered. In March 1944, the vessel had passed below a particular coordinate in the North Atlantic, a position that the navigator had logged with absolute precision because he was a precise man and because something had changed at that coordinate, and his instinct had been to record everything. The water had changed. Not its temperature, not its salinity. Those readings were unchanged. But its quality had changed, in a way the navigator struggled to find words for. He wrote, "The water here is different. It presses differently. The instruments behave as expected, but something in the behavior of the ocean itself is wrong. And then, we have surfaced to find no stars. Not overcast. Not fog. The sky was simply absent, a uniform, textureless dark overhead, no visible surface to it, no depth, just the absence of sky. The sea around them was similarly dark, calm, with no wind and no current and no horizon. They had surfaced into a space where the Atlantic Ocean, or something that had the properties of the Atlantic Ocean, continued to exist, but the world above and around it did not. They submerged again. They tried to navigate back to their last known position. The water, below, was normal. The instruments tracked normally. They surfaced again, and were in the same absence. The first year of the log was mostly navigation attempts. The captain, then a man named Brandt, who was 51 when the vessel disappeared and who died of cardiac failure in the log's 6th year, wrote with the systematic thoroughness of a man determined to solve a problem. Grid searches. Dive profiles at varying depths. Attempts to raise any signal on any frequency. A careful rationing schedule for the food and water stores, revised upward as the year progressed, and it became clear they were not consuming supplies at the rate they should have been. By the end of the first year, the crew should have been dead of starvation. Their stores should have been exhausted in months. Instead, the same cans that had been counted at the voyage's beginning were still present and still showed the same fill weight when shaken, and the crew was hungry at mealtimes and satisfied after eating, and none of this was physically possible, and the log recorded it without comment because there was nothing useful to say. They did not age. This was noted quietly in the 3rd year. The first officer, the captain and lieutenant who would eventually lead the vessel home, wrote, "Schmidt's tooth, which was loose when we left port, remains loose. No worse. Wagner's beard grows to a certain length and stops. I have not needed to cut my own hair since we arrived in this place." In the 7th year, they stopped trying to return and started simply living. This was not defeat. The log was careful to distinguish it from defeat. It was a strategic decision. They had finite energy, finite morale, and an undefined period ahead of them, and the captain decided that the energy currently spent on systematic searching would be better used on maintenance and on the mental health of the crew. The vessel needed to remain functional for whenever the opportunity came. The crew needed to remain functional for the same reason. They instituted a schedule. Watches, meals, maintenance rotations, exercise regimens developed with the limited space available. A school of sorts, Crew members teaching each other whatever they knew, the navigator teaching mathematics, the radio operator teaching electrical theory, the cook, in a remarkable entry from the log's 12th year, teaching a course in regional German literature that he had, it turned out, studied before the war. They argued. They reconciled. Two men came close to violence in the 16th year over something the log records only as a matter now resolved, and the current captain's policy is not to catalog the specifics. They mourned Brandt and two other crew members who died of causes unrelated to their circumstances, one cardiac, one appendicitis that the medical officer could not address with the equipment on board, one that the log records simply as that he chose to leave us, and which was never elaborated on. They developed their own calendar. They celebrated the anniversary of their departure, sardonically at first, then with increasing ceremony as the years accumulated, because it was the only date any of them were certain of. They celebrated birthdays on the dates they remembered, though the birthdays produced no aging. They kept records of everything because the navigator, who would eventually become the longest-serving active crew member, was the kind of man who believed that accurate records were the only evidence that time was passing at all, and that if time was passing, then eventually it would pass enough to bring them home. In the 43rd year, something changed. The log described it as a pressure shift, the same quality the navigator had noted on arrival, but reversed. The water began to feel different again. Instruments began to drift slightly from their established baseline. A star appeared overhead one night, just one, in a sky that had been starless for 4 decades, and the entire crew came up through the hatches to look at it, standing on the deck of a surface submarine in the middle of a lightless sea, staring up at a single point of light that meant something had changed. They began navigating toward it. Not toward the star, toward whatever change in the water corresponded to the star's appearance. The navigator, now the most experienced submariner among them by sheer accumulated practice, charted the relationship between the instrument drift and the direction of the small physical changes in their environment, and over 4 years of careful positioning, he moved the vessel incrementally, kilometer by kilometer, toward whatever exit from this place had opened or was opening. The star was joined by others, then by a horizon. Then, on a night in the 47th year of their subjective reckoning, which was a morning, they would learn, in November of 2023, by any external reckoning, by a coastline, by the lights of a working port, by radio signals in a language they recognized but spoken with unfamiliar cadences, broadcast by systems far beyond anything they had ever used, carrying the voices of a world that had continued without them for 79 years. They had navigated home. They had no idea where home was exactly, who still existed, what had happened, what world they were returning to. But they came in slowly, correctly, at 4 knots, using the codes they had because the codes they had were the only ones they knew, and they docked because they knew how to dock, and they opened the hatch because they were sailors, and this was a port, and that was what you did. The inquiry ran for 11 months. The vessel was impounded, studied, tested by teams of engineers, physicists, marine biologists, and historians who produced a collective 12,000 pages of documentation and reached no unified conclusion about what had occurred. The hull's metallurgical composition was consistent with 1944 manufacturing. The equipment was original. The logbooks used paper and ink compounds that were chemically consistent with their stated dates of production and showed no evidence of fabrication. The crew were examined by medical teams in the first weeks. Ages consistent, physically, with their documented birth years. Men who should have been in their 80s and 90s were instead in their 30s and 40s, exactly as old as they should have been had they left port in 1944 and aged for the 47 years the log recorded. Biologically, they were men of the mid-20th century, living in the 21st. They spoke no English beyond what they had known in 1944. They had no knowledge of any event after March of that year. They required extensive orientation before any of them could be safely released into the general population, not because they were dangerous, but because a man who last walked freely in wartime Germany and surfaces 79 years later requires a very specific kind of help adjusting to the fact that everything he knew has either transformed beyond recognition or ceased to exist. The navigator, the man who had charted their return, was the last to leave the vessel. Reyes was there for that as well. She had made a habit of being present for the notable moments, partly from professional obligation and partly because she understood, in the way that people sometimes do, that she was in the middle of something she would spend the rest of her life trying to understand, and proximity was the closest she could get to comprehension. He stood in the hatch for a long time before he came up. When he emerged onto the deck, he stood in the November morning light. Cold, flat, German November light, the harbor smelling of diesel and salt and the particular industrial smell of a working port, and he was very still for a while. Then he looked at the harbor. At the cranes, the modern vessels, the airport visible in the distance with planes crossing the approach pattern. At the city beyond. At all of it, he said quietly. I thought about this for a long time. What it would look like. What would be different?
He paused.
I could not have imagined most of this. No, Reyes said. But the water is the same. He looked at the harbor basin, at the gray northern sea beyond. I recognized the water. Even from inside, when we were close enough, I could feel that the water was the same. He turned and looked at her directly, with the eyes of a man who had spent 47 years navigating by the smallest available evidence. That is how I knew we were home. Not the instruments. Not the radio signals. The way the water felt. Reyes nodded. She didn't say anything because there was nothing adequate to say. He walked off the dock and into the waiting area where the liaison team was ready to begin the process of building him a life in a century he had never planned to inhabit. The vessel remained at the dock for 18 months while the inquiry continued. The hatches were sealed again during the examination period, and the monitoring equipment that was eventually installed throughout the hull produced no anomalous readings of any kind. It sat in its berth in the ordinary way of any moored vessel. Metal, diesel smell, a slight motion on the water with the tide. On the last night before the vessel was to be moved to a secure facility for long-term preservation, Reyes walked down to the dock alone. It was late, cold, the harbor quiet. She stood for a while looking at the hull, at the low black shape of it against the dock lights. The water around the hull was moving very slightly. Not from current or tide. The harbor was nearly calm. Just a subtle motion at the waterline, a barely visible disturbance, as if something below the hull were breathing slowly in and out. She watched it for a long time. Then she went home and did not put it in any report because some things resist the structure of a report, and because she understood, standing there in the cold harbor night, that the 47 years and the 79 years, and the impossible clean hull, and the unchanging crew were all details, documentation, evidence, the accumulated record of something that had happened. What the water was doing at the hull's waterline was something else. That was the thing still continuing.